In January of 2017, a couple sitting at their kitchen table in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee, did something that most people in their situation would have found too painful to do. They added up all of their debt. Not the monthly payments, not the approximate balances they carried in their heads. Every debt, every balance, every interest rate, written down on a single piece of paper in a single column with a total at the bottom. The total was $492,000. Student loans from 2 graduate degrees, a mortgage on a house they had purchased at the peak of their confidence about their financial trajectory, 2 car loans on vehicles that had seemed reasonable at the time of purchase, credit card balances that had accumulated during a period of income instability 2 years earlier and had never fully been paid down, a personal loan that had seemed like a good solution to a problem that had since resolved itself. All of it together, laid out in a single column on a piece of paper, came to $492,000. They were both professionals, combined household income of approximately $130,000 per year. 2 children, a mortgage payment, child care costs, and the full range of financial obligations that characterize a middle-class family in an American city in the second decade of the 21st century. By the standards of the personal finance content they had consumed, their situation was not unusual. Many households carry significant debt. The conventional advice they had received was to make the minimum payments, perhaps accelerate the student loans a little, and trust that their income would grow enough over time to make the whole thing manageable. They decided to do something different, not because they had access to information that was unavailable to other households in their situation, not because they had a financial advantage that made what followed easier for them than it would be for someone else, but because sitting at that kitchen table and looking at the number $492,000 produced a clarity about the direction their financial life was heading that the abstract awareness of their debt had never produced before. 5 years and 3 months later, in April of 2022, they made their final debt payment. The mortgage, the student loans, the car loans, the credit cards, the personal loan. All of it. Gone. $492,000 eliminated on a combined income that never exceeded $150,000 during the payoff period, while raising 2 children, while contributing to retirement accounts throughout the process, while maintaining an emergency fund that never dropped below 3 months of expenses. This is the story of how they did it. And more importantly, it is the story of what their methods reveal about the gap between what most people believe is financially possible for a household in their circumstances and what is actually possible when financial intentionality is applied with a consistency that most people never sustain long enough to find out what it produces. Let us start with the decision itself, because the decision preceded all of the specific methods, and in many ways was more important than any of them. The couple did not decide to pay off their debt because they encountered a specific debt payoff methodology or a financial influencer whose approach seemed compelling. They decided because the experience of writing the number down and looking at it produced an emotional response that changed the way they related to their financial situation. Before that evening at the kitchen table, their debt was something they managed. After it, their debt was something they were at war with. The shift was not primarily intellectual, it was emotional. And the emotional shift was what sustained the behavioral changes that followed over 5 years and 3 months when the intellectual commitment alone would have been insufficient. This is the first lesson that their story contains, and the most important one. Financial behavior change of the magnitude required to pay off nearly $500,000 of debt on a middle-class income is not primarily a technical challenge. The methods are not complicated. The math is straightforward. The challenge is sustaining behavior that is inconsistent with the default patterns of the culture around you for long enough to produce an outcome that is dramatically inconsistent with the financial outcomes that most households in similar circumstances produce. That kind of sustained behavior change requires an emotional foundation, a felt sense of why the goal matters that is powerful enough to override the social pressure, the inconvenience, and the delayed gratification that the process requires over years rather than months. The number on the piece of paper provided that emotional foundation for this couple. For someone else, it might be a different trigger. The calculation of how many years of work the current debt trajectory implies. The visualization of what financial freedom would actually feel like and what it would make possible. The recognition of what the interest payments alone are costing every month and what those dollars could be doing instead. The specific trigger matters less than the emotional reality it produces. Without an emotional foundation that is strong enough to sustain the commitment over years, the technical methods are insufficient. Now let us look at the specific methods because they are genuinely instructive and not particularly complicated. The first decision was to consolidate and organize the debt in a way that made the payoff process feel tractable rather than overwhelming. $492,000 is a number that produces paralysis when encountered as a total. Broken into individual debts arranged by balance and interest rate, it becomes a list of specific targets that can be approached one at a time. They listed every debt from smallest balance to largest balance, regardless of interest rate, and commit Ted to directing every available dollar toward the smallest balance first while making minimum payments on everything else. This approach is called the debt snowball method, and it is not mathematically optimal. The mathematically optimal approach, called the avalanche method, directs extra payments toward the highest interest rate debt first, which minimizes the total interest paid over the payoff period. The couple was aware of this. They chose the snowball method deliberately because the behavioral research on debt payoff completion rates shows that the snowball method produces higher completion rates than the avalanche method, despite being mathematically inferior. The early wins of eliminating smaller balances produce the motivational momentum that sustains a process through the years required to eliminate the larger ones. The mathematically superior approach that gets abandoned halfway through produces worse outcomes than the mathematically inferior approach that gets completed. This decision reflects a sophistication about human motivation that is more important than mathematical optimization in the context of a multi-year behavioral commitment. The best debt payoff method is the one that you will actually complete. For most people, that is the snowball method, and the couple's awareness of this fact about themselves and their own motivational psychology was a more valuable insight than any specific financial calculation they made during the payoff process. The second decision was about income, and it was the decision that made the timeline possible rather than just the intention. On a combined income of $130,000, paying off $492,000 in 5 years would require directing approximately $82,000 per year toward debt repayment. After taxes, retirement contributions, and the minimum payments on all debts, the couple's net income available for both living expenses and additional debt payments was significantly less than that. The gap between what their base income would support and what the 5-year timeline required was substantial. They closed the gap through income expansion rather than expense elimination alone. The wife, who had a background in project management, began taking on freelance consulting work on evenings and weekends, initially earning an additional $1,000 to $2,000 per month beyond her primary income. Over 3 years, as her consulting reputation grew and her client base expanded, this side income reached $5,000 to $7,000 per month. The husband, who worked in technology, pursued and obtained 2 promotions during the payoff period and supplemented his salary income with occasional contract work that added several $1,000s per year. The combination of expense reduction and income expansion is the most powerful debt payoff dynamic available to any household, and it is significantly more powerful than either approach alone. Expense reduction has a floor. There's a minimum level of spending below which a family cannot go without compromising the health, the stability, and the quality of life that make the long-term commitment sustainable. Income expansion does not have the same ceiling. The additional income that the wife generated through consulting was applied almost entirely to debt reduction because the family's expenses had already been trimmed to a level that did not expand to absorb the additional income. This is the critical behavioral discipline that determined the effectiveness of the income expansion strategy. Additional income that flows into a higher lifestyle produces no debt reduction benefit. Additional income that is directed entirely toward debt while the lifestyle remains stable produces dramatic acceleration of the payoff timeline. The couple maintained their lifestyle at essentially the same level for 5 years while directing every dollar of income growth and side income toward debt elimination. This was not comfortable. It was sustainable because the emotional commitment to the goal was strong enough to override the social and psychological pressure to upgrade the lifestyle as the income grew. The third decision was about the mortgage, and it was the most controversial element of their approach when they discussed it publicly because it ran counter to the conventional financial advice they had received and the conventional financial wisdom of most people in their social circle. The conventional advice for a household with significant debt is to prioritize the retirement account contributions and the mortgage separately from other consumer debt, treating them as long-term financial tools rather than as debts to be eliminated aggressively. The mortgage in particular is frequently excluded from aggressive payoff strategies because the interest rate is typically lower than consumer debt rates, and because the mortgage interest deduction provides a tax benefit that partially offsets the interest cost. The couple included the mortgage in their debt payoff plan from the beginning. They treated it as debt, not as a financial tool, because the experience of writing down the number and looking at it had produced in them an emotional relationship with all of their debt that did not distinguish between its financial characteristics. They wanted it gone, all of it. And they were willing to accept the mathematical suboptimality of aggressively paying down a low-interest mortgage rather than investing the equivalent dollars in higher returning assets in exchange for the psychological and practical benefits of eliminating all debt completely. This decision is not universally right. For some households in some circumstances, the mathematically superior approach of maintaining a low-interest mortgage and investing the difference in equity markets is the better choice. But for this couple, the decision to include the mortgage in the payoff plan produced a motivational clarity and an intensity of commitment that contributed to the speed of the payoff in ways that are difficult to quantify, but that they describe as essential to completing the process. The fourth element of their approach was the community they built around the goal. Shortly after committing to the debt payoff, the wife began documenting their progress on a social media account that attracted a following of other households pursuing similar goals. The community that formed around this documentation provided accountability, encouragement during the months when progress felt slow, and a social context in which their financial choices were celebrated rather than viewed as deprivation. This element of their story is instructive in a way that extends beyond the debt payoff context. Human financial behavior is deeply social. The spending patterns and lifestyle expectations that most people default to are largely determined by the norms of the social groups they belong to and the social environments they inhabit. Creating a social environment where the financial goal being pursued is the norm rather than the exception produces a social reinforcement of the goal-directed behavior rather than social pressure against it. The couple's online community provided that environment when their physical social environment, which was populated by peers who were not pursuing aggressive debt payoff, could not. The fifth element was the system for managing the inevitable setbacks and deviations that occur in any 5-year behavioral commitment. There were months when unexpected expenses consumed dollars that had been planned for debt repayment. There were months when the motivation was low and the sacrifice felt disproportionate to the progress. There were moments when the goal seemed too distant to sustain the behaviors required to reach it. The couple managed these inevitable setbacks through 2 specific practices. The first was a monthly financial review that recalculated the projected payoff date based on current balances and current income, which kept the end date visible and tangible even during months when progress was slower than planned. The second was what they called a why document, a written articulation of the specific reasons they were pursuing the goal and the specific vision of what their financial lives would look like when the debt was gone. Returning to the why document during difficult months reconnected them to the emotional foundation of the commitment in a way that the technical progress tracking alone could not. There's one more element of this story that is worth discussing explicitly because it is the element that is most frequently overlooked in the public conversation about debt payoff success stories. The couple's outcome was not available to every household in their situation. Their combined professional income, even before the side income expansion, placed them in a range that gave them the financial flexibility to pursue an aggressive payoff strategy without compromising their children's basic needs or their own health. The strategies they used are more accessible to households with professional incomes than to households where the gap between income and unavoidable expenses is narrow enough that aggressive payoff strategies create genuine hardship rather than manageable discomfort. This does not make their story less instructive. It means that the specific application of the lessons needs to be calibrated to the specific financial circumstances of the household applying them. The debt snowball method works at every income level. The income expansion strategy is available to most households with marketable professional skills. The emotional foundation and the community support are available regardless of income. The monthly review practice in the Y document costs nothing. The specific timeline and the specific dollar amounts will differ. The underlying principles do not. $492,000 in 5 years and 3 months. Not through luck, not through a financial windfall, not through a strategy that was available only to them and not to other households in similar circumstances. Through a combination of emotional clarity about the goal, behavioral systems that made the goal-directed behavior automatic where possible and accountable where not. Income expansion that was directed entirely toward the goal, and a consistency sustained over 63 months that produced an outcome that most people in their situation had been told and had told themselves was not possible. The outcome was possible. It required everything they gave it, and it produced on the other side a relationship with money and a set of financial possibilities that neither of them had believed were accessible to people with their starting point. Next week on Quiet Rich, I'm telling the story of the man who turned $5,000 into $50 million on a single stock. Amazon, bought back in the 90s when almost everyone thought it was reckless. How he identified it before anyone understood what it would become, how he held through a 90% crash without selling, and what his decision reveals about the difference between risk that is genuinely intelligent and risk that only looks intelligent after the outcome is known. Subscribe so you do not miss it. New videos every Tuesday and Friday.